Greetings, everyone. My name is Emily Louie, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I would like to welcome you to Fundraising Communications 3, Preparing Volunteer Leaders to Serve as Ambassadors, the third webinar in our free Fundraising Communications series. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. First, please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Next, we recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. And if you experience any visual issues, please send a chat to Campbell & Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you'll earn one continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. In that same follow-up email, you'll also receive a link to download today's slides along with a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar, so please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. We will also hold time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters today, Christina Black, Communications Senior Consultant, and Christina Yoon, Vice President and East Region Director.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Christina Black, Senior Consultant on the Communications team here at Campbell & Company. Very happy to be with you all today and very happy to have you all with us. I wanted to thank you for taking some time out to join us, and more importantly, thank you all for the hard work that you're doing right now to keep your missions and your organizations moving forward. So hopefully we have some helpful ideas to share with you today as you all are doing that work. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Tina Yoon, now.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be able to meet with you all during this time of social distancing. I'm personally finding that I'm really looking forward to opportunities to engage with others online in any form, anytime, and so we just thank you all for joining us. To give you a brief introduction, just wanted to let you know that I work out of the Washington, D.C. area. I've been with Campbell & Company for about 5.5 years, and I work with organizations in a variety of sectors up and down the East Coast. But one thing, despite all the differences that my clients have from one another, one constant remains true, and that is that all of them face common challenges with how to engage their volunteers as ambassadors in fundraising. And so we're very excited to be with you here today, where we can share with you what we've learned from our work with our clients, and so that all of you working with volunteers will no longer be a challenge, but maybe turn into actually being a joy. So let's go to the next slide. Just going to have a quick review of what we're going to cover in today's session. So we'll divide it into 3 sections. The first is why engage volunteers. We'll want to discuss this because it's actually so much work, and the question is it worth the effort? So we'll talk about that. Next, we'll share some engagement strategies that we found to be effective. And finally, we'll end with some discussion time. We hope that you'll be thinking about, if you have examples from your own work that you'd be willing to share with us, we'd love to learn from that as well. And of course, if you have questions, please go ahead and be entering those into the chat box as Emily mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay, so to start, let's discuss why should we engage volunteers as ambassadors. So on this next slide, wanted to just cover, this is what we hear from organizations that we work with. These are very common responses that we get. Some people say, my volunteers won't ask. Others say, it's really just not worth the effort. It's so much work, and what do we get in return? And finally, my volunteers don't actually feel comfortable making the case, and it's hard to get them to a place of comfort. And so maybe some of these reasons sound familiar to you. It seems that there are so many reasons not to engage volunteers in this important role. But before we move on to the next section, we thought it would be good to just take a moment and do a quick live poll with all of you on the line. And we'd love to hear from all of you. What challenge do you hear most often from volunteers when asking them to serve as ambassadors? We'd love for you to just go ahead and check off all that apply. Your volunteers say they don't want to ask for money. Some of them are afraid of questions they might get and don't know what to answer. Some of them say they're just way too busy. Perhaps they don't feel like they have appropriate materials, or maybe the issue is they feel like they don't have a good elevator pitch. So let's just take a moment here and check off. And Emily, you can let us know how we're doing with the responses here.
We'll just wait a few more seconds.
Okay, great. Okay, here are the results. I love this. Okay, so we've got biggest problem. Most of them don't want to ask for money. That came in at 80%. Next highest, too busy, about half. About a third of you said they're afraid of questions, they don't feel like they have an elevator pitch, and finally, no materials. Okay, so this was very helpful. I'm sure there might be other reasons as well. If you feel like at the end of the webinar we didn't really address some of these challenges that you have, please bring them up at the end. Okay, so the big question, why bother? Right? This is a great question to ask. So one key point we wanted to make is that volunteers are the champions that money can't buy. So first of all, they confer trust. So someone outside of the staff of the organization is vouching for your organization. They're spending their personal time to advocate for the organization, and this speaks volumes. Second, they convey passion. So when volunteers get excited about an organization, they speak from the heart with conviction and passion. And, you know, I've actually seen volunteers tear up or get very emotional when they talk about why they care about a particular organization and why it's meaningful to them. And you can't fake that, and it's priceless. Finally, creating a connection. So when a volunteer introduces someone to your organization, and it's someone that you don't know, they are actually serving as a bridge between you and that party, and you otherwise wouldn't really have a reason to call them. And so not only can they help open doors and create a connection that way, we actually find that when they're present at meetings, they kind of serve as the glue between the different parties that are present. So it's really helpful in that sense as well. The other reason with volunteers why it's important to engage them is that when they speak, people listen. So first of all, they amplify the work of the staff, and we can actually accomplish so much more together. So imagine you have a small staff. Maybe you are the only person on the team who actually does fundraising. Maybe you do it full time, but maybe it's only a part of your time. So you have a limited number of people that you can reach out to and try to fundraise from. And so if you can imagine, if you have a board of, let's say, 10 to 15 people, each of them agrees to do 5 outreaches, already, you know, you're getting up to like 50 more people that you could reach out to. Secondly, they give it their time and energy freely, which lends credibility. And this is kind of similar to what we mentioned on the previous slide, that they confer trust. These volunteers have personal relationships with the audience you're trying to reach. So people are more willing to take a meeting from someone that they know. And it's no longer a cold call, actually, when the volunteer is brokering the meeting. And finally, by sharing the case, volunteers become even more invested. And I love this one because it's really one of the most magical things that happens. So as volunteers internalize the case and the key messages and the stories of impact with your organization, they actually end up believing it even more deeply. You know, learning for them to learn how to articulate your organization's mission in their own words, and then actually repeating it back to others over and over again really just reminds them time and again how much they actually care. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christina, and she'll take us through some of the strategies.
Great, thank you. So for this next session, for each of the strategies that we share, we'll begin by sharing that overarching strategy, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper for each example to give some more tactical applications for each of these strategies that we've seen with our clients. So for strategy number 1, one of the things that we want you to think about is really just starting with the basics and not making assumptions. So one of the challenges that we see sometimes with clients is that staff, because they're really living and breathing the case every day, because they're very familiar with the materials, because they really have adopted the case as their own, sometimes it can be challenging to get into that beginner mindset or to put yourself in the shoes of a volunteer who maybe doesn't have the opportunity. So it's very important that you be clear about what your expectations are, opportunities are, etc. So some of the things that we want to make sure that you are communicating very clearly with your volunteers would include, number one, here is what we expect. So this connects back to the live poll that we just did a few moments ago where we said, folks are really afraid to make the ask. And oftentimes that's not the expectation, or it's not the only expectation. So maybe you're satisfied to have volunteers open doors for you. Maybe you want them to share their elevator pitch, but helping them to understand where that bar is and what your expectations really truly are of them as a volunteer can be helpful. The next thing that we want you to be very clear about are sharing the opportunities for engagement. So again, if folks have that making the ask in their head, they might not be thinking about the power of something like making a thank you call, or the power of having an in-person conversation, or connecting with a prospective supporter at an event. So being very clear about what those opportunities are, when they're happening, etc. The next thing we want you to do is to think about how you are supporting your volunteers, how you're ready to support them in sharing the case and serving as an ambassador, and being very clear with them about what that support structure or process is. So it could be something as simple as you've got an event coming up, you want them to be on hand, you want them to talk to person A, B, and C, having a conversation with them beforehand so that you're clear about that expectation and prepping them as needed. This also could include someone on your staff working with them to customize a pitch or to practice an elevator speech, something like that. Just be very, very clear about where you're going to plug in and support them in this process. And then lastly, you want to make sure that they know what their tools are and also where they can find them. This is something that's very basic, but it's a common disconnect that we see. So for example, when I'm working with clients, we may create a slide deck, we may create a brochure, an FAQ document, a one-pager. We have these great tools available, and oftentimes volunteers are either not looped in, or they've been looped in, but maybe they missed that email, or maybe they forgot that point that was shared at an earlier meeting. So making sure that you're very clear about what the tools are and then where they can find them. So make sure you're looking in your board folder on Dropbox to see the brochure, that sort of thing. So for this initial strategy, we've got a few proven tactics that we have seen with our clients. The first here is to be sure that you're putting these expectations in writing, and also, again, making sure you're clear about what your expectations are beyond making the ask. And Tina has a helpful example that she can share here.
Yeah, so I think it's important to have these expectations to be shared in conversation with board members, but then to go that extra step after the conversation that you may be having as a whole group together, it's important to have, or it's very helpful to actually have one-on-one meetings with the board members and talk about, are they comfortable with this? Out of all the various different ways that they can help, which ones are they interested in helping out with? And just have that dialogue. And then to check in with them partway through the year and see how things are going, and maybe they haven't had a chance to do some of the things they said they wanted to do, figure out a way to make it happen. And then it can be very helpful to put down what their, in essence, commitments are in writing. And some folks go as far as calling it like a board member contract. And if that's sort of like a scary way of putting things for your board, then you can be a little less formal about it. But I do think it helps to actually document what your conversations have included and what the expectations are. And these are really like things that they have said themselves that they would like to help with. And so we feel like it's helpful, put it in writing, and then to check back in afterwards a few months later.
Great. Thanks, Tina. The next tactic here is to have regular mission moments. This is something that I certainly see regularly with my clients. And one way that you might think about a mission moment, or however you choose to describe it, is as the input for your board members. If the output is them serving as an ambassador, you need to give them fodder, whether it's specific stories or examples they can share, whether it's having program staff come in and talk about, a recent success or programmatic impact, helping them to understand how you're moving your mission forward, and sharing that information on a regular basis is really, really critical. And Tina has another client example to share here.
Yeah, so this is, I was really excited to share this with you because it was really amazing what happened. We had a theater client that was doing a renovation of their theater. All of the campaign steering committee members were actually from the board in this case, and they had been part of discussions about this theater renovation for months, actually years leading up to the actual launch of the campaign. So they were, in essence, what we thought, very familiar with the project and knew what it was about and knew why it was needed. But we found that the committee members actually felt like they had a hard time saying, what is the case for support? Why do we actually need this renovation? And so what we decided to do was take them on a tour of the theater during one of our steering committee meetings. It was 30 minutes, so it was pretty brief. We walked them floor by floor through the building. The artistic director was there. The executive director was there. We had floor plans as like handouts so they could see what some of the changes would be. And we were able to say, like, over here, the wall's going to move and this is going to happen. It's going to be better for the artist because of this or that. One specific example I'd like to share with you about this is this particular theater actually doesn't have an elevator today. But obviously, it makes it difficult for folks who have issues with mobility. And as we were on the tour, we showed them where this elevator was going to be placed. And we were able to explain, clear examples. There are student programs where the kids come in and do educational programming with the theater. The parents are invited or family members are invited to observe their final production. And there are some parents that actually can't participate because of mobility issues, accessibility issues. Another is the artistic director, while we were on the tour, shared very briefly about this one brilliant actor that he had met. They really wanted to hire for the upcoming production, but she's in a wheelchair. She can't actually make it to the rehearsal room, so they were not able to make that offer to her. So these were like really heartbreaking examples, and not to mention the fact that some of our steering committee members were a little on the older side, had trouble going up and down all the stairs, they're huffing and puffing. So that really brought it home. We actually convened in the conference room afterwards for our meeting, and we had a chance to debrief. We asked each member who was there, tell us, what was most exciting to you about what you learned today from our tour. And it was really heartfelt and almost emotional for some of these folks. And these are patrons of the theater. I mean, they are going in and out, being able to take part in productions and theater, and yet for them, having that behind the scenes look was actually very powerful. And it gave them something that they could talk about from personal experience when they had meetings with prospects in the future. So that's my quick story there.
Yeah, great. So the next thing that you want to be sure to do is to include very specific opportunities to share the case on calendars. And so obviously we mean big events, but especially in this environment where a lot of big events are being postponed or canceled, you want to think about what are the other specific opportunities that you could share for your board members or for your other opportunities or your other volunteers to share the case. And I know, Tina, you've got an example of a client that does this on a very regular basis.
Yeah, one of my clients actually, whenever they have any sort of volunteer meeting, they always have a one-page sheet which lists out upcoming events, opportunities for them to invite their friends, places where they can plug in, and they just come to expect it every meeting, and it just shows the things that are coming up over the next couple of months. And I think that's a really great way to keep it top of mind for these volunteers.
Absolutely. And that connects to the next tactic here, which is anytime you have one of these opportunities emerge, you want to make sure that you're recruiting. In other words, you're very specifically delegating this task. You don't want to just generally say, hey, folks, we want you to be on hand to talk about the organization. It's more helpful if you can be very specific about, okay, these are the 3 or 5 folks who we want to specifically touch base with beforehand, and make sure you're having preparatory conversations. I'll say this serves 2 important purposes. Number one is it helps us to prepare our volunteers to serve as ambassadors, to deliver the case. The other thing is this is an engagement opportunity for volunteers, remembering that our volunteers, especially board leaders, are frequently also donors or prospective donors. So it's really a 2-for-1. It's an opportunity to engage them more deeply, help them to feel like the insiders that they are. So it's really an important and a good opportunity for us to take advantage of. So now we're going to move on to strategy number 2. So my background is in education, specifically higher education. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how folks learn, specifically how adults learn. And that certainly overlaps with the topic that we have here today. And what's really, really critical, frankly, even from the time we're infants, is modeling. Being able to see someone else show us how it's done. And we have a great quote here about the environment in which adults learn best, specifically learning with others while sharing what they already know. So board groups are a really great environment where this is possible, especially when you may have some folks who are more seasoned who can do some modeling. So this is a really, really powerful tool, making sure that we create opportunities to show volunteers how it's done, not just tell them to do it. And here are some tactics that we've seen work with clients that may work with you in your organization. So first and foremost, we have this idea of using a more experienced volunteer as a model to share either an anecdote or their elevator pitch, whatever the case may be, so that some of the newer volunteers might see how it's done. And Tina, again, has an example that she can share here.
Great. So another client that I work with, they have a very specific mission. But the issue for them is that there are 2 other organizations that are very similarly named and work in kind of a similar space, but are distinct from them. And the 3 of them get confused and mixed up in donors' minds all the time. So we knew that this was a key point that we had to help our volunteers understand for themselves what is the actual difference, and that how could they explain it to others in a way that's really easy for them to understand. So what we decided to do here was we created a scenario in which we had one volunteer serve as like the volunteer ambassador, and the other volunteer pretend to be a prospect that doesn't really know that much about this organization. And we just set up a situation where they met at a cocktail party, and they had a few minutes to talk. And so these 2 volunteers demonstrated this conversation in front of the rest of the steering committee for the campaign. So what was really effective about this is that it provided the volunteers a chance to hear how one of their peers explains it in their own words. And we were able to then have a discussion afterwards about this really tough question. And we discussed what did we really like about what that volunteer said, how they worded it. Was it a certain phrase? Was it the way that they provided the extra context in the background? You know, what was it about that was effective about how they talked about the differences between these 3 organizations and what made this organization unique and special? But what it also did was we also said, you know, we found that some people chimed in and said, well, actually, when I talk about that issue, I say this. And someone else, well, I usually use this. And that was wonderful because we got to hear different examples from different people, and it generated a lot of good discussion and conversation. It helped us to tease out the full nuances, you know, all the nuances between these 3 organizations. And one final comment I wanted to make about this is that we actually conducted this discussion over the phone. So I know some of you are thinking, oh, role playing, maybe we have to like be in person, act it out in front of a group. But no, actually, we did this one, and this was not in the time of this pandemic, but it was several months ago. We did this one over the phone. So you don't necessarily have to be in person. It is possible to do this by phone, video, and it still works very well.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I'll say that it actually applies, I think, to all of these tactics or things that can be adapted to execute virtually. So the next, in addition to having a more experienced volunteer kind of model for our less experienced volunteers, how they share the case, the other stakeholders that I think it's really important to involve in this process would be your fundraisers or your program staff. So going back to the point that I made earlier about, you know, folks who work with the organization were involved in that program or were immersed in that case 40 plus hours a week. So something that I find is tremendously helpful is allowing volunteers to hear how fundraisers talk about it. or to hear how program staff talk about it. For many organizations, especially something, for example, in the social services space, a lot of the times those program staff are really the rock stars of the organization. They're the ones who are executing on mission, and having the opportunity to hear from them is something that can really be inspiring for volunteers, and then also help to build comfort around the case and being able to talk about the organization's work. Lastly, the final tactic listed here is teamwork. And this is where you're taking it out of the kind of practice space of whether that's a board meeting or a virtual training, and taking it out into the real world. So when you're asking a volunteer to start sharing the case, instead of having them do that solo, allowing them to do that in pairs, either with a more experienced volunteer or staff, as a kind of training wheels of being an ambassador, can be something that's tremendously helpful. So it's something that you could consider. Moving on to strategy number 3. So if strategy number 2 was being able to see how someone else does it, strategy number 3 is where we're moving toward hands-on learning. And if there's one thing that I've seen with, really any independent school client or any higher ed client, it's this understanding of the importance of interactive and hands-on learning. And what you'll see in the deck that we'll share right after this is for each of these sources, we link to an article, and this is the one that I personally found most interesting. And that's about the actual changes that happen in the brain when you physically experience, as opposed to just reading or listening, something like that. So it's tremendously helpful. It's neurological and it's psychological. So you're creating competence, but you're also creating confidence by allowing folks to practice and see that they are actually quite capable of sharing the case. So a few tactics on this front. Number 1, interactive case development. So one of the things that we do with clients, or that I do with clients as a member of the communications team, is we're working to do things like creating a case for a campaign, naming the effort, writing brochures, things of that nature. And I want to be very clear about this. Every single one of those engagements, we are involving volunteers in the process of case development. That's very purposeful, and it's very important. It creates understanding, it creates buy-in, and then when that process is done, what you're going to see is a group of volunteers who know that case inside and out because they've been with you the entire time building it, and they're also really excited to share it because they believe in it. They've got their hands on it. So that's something that's tremendously important. The next thing that you might consider is starting with the easy ask first. Again, I'll refer back to that live poll. It's something that we hear again and again, and I'm not at all surprised to see that result, that folks are really not comfortable with asking for money a lot of the time. So start by asking them to do something more simple, like a thank you call. Or one idea that you might consider right now in this environment, especially if your organization is experiencing something like having to cancel a special event or something of that nature, you might ask your volunteers to help you to pitch in, to make some calls to explain the situation, give them some talking points to say, here's why we're canceling the event. Obviously, it's an abundance of caution. Here's how you can still support our organization, and give them some talking points so that they feel comfortable doing that. It doesn't have to be jumping right into the deep end and making those big asks. Think of the easy tasks you can ask them to begin with first. Next, this do-it-yourself example, this ties back to one of the examples that Tina shared earlier, and I'll ask her to expand a bit on this. But again, it's having volunteers to do things firsthand. So some organizations have really good opportunities to do things like this. For example, maybe you have a food bank or some other program that is very volunteer-based, and folks have an opportunity to firsthand experience what your mission is. So that can be something that's really helpful. Tina, did you have another example that you wanted to share here?
Sure. Yeah. So I think this is similar to the benefit of going on the tour that I described earlier, because it was interesting. Each of the volunteers noticed different things. Different things resonated with them. There were other aspects of the tour that really spoke to certain folks, and it just gives them that personal story. They can go back to their friends and say, I was on the tour and you should have seen it. It was like this. I couldn't believe it. We need to get this done. This is so important to the future of our community and the health of the theater. You know, I mean, they have a way that they can describe it from personal experience. It's easier for them to remember. It's more heartfelt. It's more authentic. And so I think giving them these anecdotes in their arsenal for them to be able to share is really helpful.
Great, thanks. And then lastly, we have this idea of the volunteer-led training and practice. So this is very, very important and very effective. The example that Tina gave earlier is a good one here. But again, creating opportunities to formally have folks run through whatever the case is, whether it's you want them to make a pitch for the campaign, you want them to give their elevator speech, having volunteers lead and then execute on that session can be really helpful. And I believe, Tina, you have an example for this one too.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about an independent school client, and this was an exercise that we did with the campaign steering committee just earlier this month, a couple weeks ago, when we were still meeting in person. And we asked them as a group, what are some tough questions that you think we should be prepared to answer? So these may be questions that they themselves as steering committees were kind of scratching their heads about and wondering and maybe needed some clarity on. They could have been things that maybe one of their friends had asked them along the way, or they could be things that they anticipate someone will ask them, but they're not quite sure how to answer. So here are some examples of some questions that came up. One was, what does it mean that our campaign is a comprehensive campaign? That caused a lot of confusion with the annual fund and the capital component endowment. So we talked about that. Another question, what is endowment and why is it important to the life of our school? So that was another one. Another, why is this building so expensive? It's millions of dollars, and some people didn't quite know how to answer that question. Another, why doesn't tuition cover everything that the school needs? Another, my child won't actually benefit, so why should I give to this campaign? So, you know, these are examples of things that came up in our discussion. We had a chance to discuss it, and it was really interesting because I was there as a consultant. The staff were there, the head of school was there. But it was interesting, for some of these questions, volunteers jumped in with what they think the answer is, and it was great to see them interact in that way. It's great to see them like processing it, thinking about how they would explain it. And some of them even said, like for the one, my child won't benefit, so why should I give? One of them even said, it's all about setting the culture of philanthropy at this school and to understand how philanthropy has made such a difference over the years and our children are benefiting today from prior years of philanthropy. You know, I mean, that was beautifully said and even more effective when someone heard it from their peer as being the one to express that thought. And so we had a great discussion. We found that we had an opportunity to talk through these questions and help them articulate answers. There were some where it was clear no one quite knew the answer. We turned to the head of school who was able to answer some of these. But our next step is, is to be able to put these down in writing. And we consider this to be a living document, meaning that we will continue to expand or tweak some of our responses. We'll continue to add more questions as time goes on. New questions will emerge. We are going to go back and discuss these after they've had some of their meetings with prospects and they realize, oh, I thought I understood the answer to that question, but when I was actually put on the spot and had to answer it, I really couldn't find the right words. And so it gives you, gives you a resource that you can continue to go back to in the future. And it was really helpful for the staff too, because even just us consultant likewise, for us to realize that there is confusion still out there about why we're calling this a comprehensive campaign, what's the purpose of it being comprehensive, and what does it mean for, all these different kinds of gifts that are coming in. So that was a great opportunity, and just really encourage you to think about using that kind of tactic.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I'll say is, what we heard from you all today about your volunteers being afraid of the questions that they might face. This is a really great example of how you can help them to face that fear and hopefully to get over it. And again, a lot of the questions and answers that are generated from the volunteer perspective are just going to be tremendously helpful, especially for that donor audience, because the donor audience, much like the volunteer, again, is not the staff member, is not the fundraiser or the program person who lives and breathes it every single day. It's getting into that mindset of the volunteer, of the donor, and helping to articulate what are the big questions and, more importantly, what are the big answers. So really love that example. Okay, strategy number 4. It's tremendously basic, but tremendously important. It's not a lot of fun, but it's very effective. Again, we have a good quote here. I'm going to go ahead and read you the longer version of this quote because I think it's worth it. That is that studies have shown that spaced repetition is an effective way to learn many different types of information. It can be used to help school-age kids learn spelling words or multiplication problems, or university students to learn new vocabulary words in a foreign language. With some assistance from family members, people with severe memory disorders like Alzheimer's disease can be taught new names using spaced repetition. So having the opportunity to get that same information multiple times across time, that's something that's really helpful, frankly, for any person to be able to learn something that's complicated or challenging, or you just need to have repeated a few times for you. So it just really can't be one and done. You have to accept that it's a process and commit to that process. So a few tactics that we have seen with our clients. Number 1 is just offering multiple opportunities. So we gave you some examples earlier of modeling, as well as some hands-on ways that you can address this, but those can't just happen in isolation. They can't be one and done, check the box, we're moving on. There needs to be multiple opportunities. This is something that I saw with a community foundation client of ours. They were embarking on a very ambitious strategic plan. It's something that's new, exciting, and perhaps a little bit scary for some folks. And understandably, their volunteer leaders are nervous about sharing that case, but they really wanted to be helpful. So what they did is they created, number 1, many trainings. So they had, several opportunities for folks to participate, even multiple times if they so choose. And then they created it as a standing item as well for their board meetings, so that folks had an opportunity to revisit that case time and time again. And they used several of the tactics that we've already covered today at those varying sessions. So making it something that folks have multiple opportunities to practice and to share. The other thing that you can think about is repeating across different formats and different settings. Again, tremendously helpful in this environment where we're all having to think about different formats and settings for getting our work done. So this could be emails, it could be holding a webinar like the one you're participating in today. You could do a live stream. That's something that could even work for that facility tour that Tina described earlier. If you can't host folks in person, you could maybe do a Facebook Live, something like that, so that you can live stream, host a virtual meeting, take one-on-one calls with folks. So don't be afraid to really experiment and find different ways to prepare your volunteers to serve as ambassadors. Next, revisit concepts after volunteers have practiced it firsthand. This is something that I think is tremendously important. You could think of this as, back when you were a school kid, having like a project to complete on your own or a homework assignment, going out there and actually doing it, and then having an opportunity to say, okay, now that I've actually done it, what new questions do I have? What new insights do I have? And coming back to it after they have that firsthand experience can be just really transformational. Tina, did you have an example that you wanted to share for this one?
I think that you covered it really well. I mean, I guess I would say that, it is different after someone's had their first experience of having a meeting. It just raises all sorts of new questions that they didn't know that they had. And so this idea of repeat, I've even seen it with steering committees that I've worked with, that we do the training, the volunteers get sent out for their first meetings. They come back and they're like, oh, this went great, and I was able to share this or that, but then they asked me this question and I wasn't sure how to answer it. Or someone else says, oh, they asked me a question that wasn't on our FAQ. I didn't know what to say, so let's add it, because let's come up with what the answer should be. And so, but then to even with these committees that have been going for a couple of years, we still come back to this. Some questions that come up with some of your leadership level donors, so some of your biggest donors, may be different from the questions that come up with folks that are at the lower levels of the gift chart. They may be just thinking about different things. They may have more questions about maybe they have less experience with philanthropy. What are the different kinds of ways that I can give, and I mean, what if I can't fit it in within the 5-year pledge period? Do I have other options? Things like that. And so to give you a chance to be able to cover all of those, if you kind of just hand them a document with all the questions and the answers there, it's really not that likely that they'll be able to absorb all that information, and they will learn over time more and more as they become more experienced. And so the repeat is, multiple times really does make a big difference.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And then the last tactic we have here is just don't be afraid to send reminders and to repeat yourself as needed. And I would add, send reminders to yourself, right? So part of this strategy and part of these tactics is accepting the fact that we're all human, accepting the fact that folks need an opportunity to practice. Folks need to be reminded. You don't always remember things the very first time that you hear it. This is just the way that we work as humans. It's the way that our brains operate. So number one, just allowing our volunteers the space to be people and to be patient and to do the things that you need to do in order for them to be effective in their role as ambassadors. The other thing that I'll say is, ideally, you will always be recruiting new volunteers, having new folks come into the fold who are excited to share. So you shouldn't view this as something that's a bad thing or something that's onerous. If you've got new folks coming in and you're having to, I feel like I'm always having to redo this, or I'm always having to repeat myself, or I feel like we just did this training, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It could mean that you as an organization are embarking on a remarkable opportunity in bringing new folks in. So I say embrace that and really lean into this, and be patient with yourself as you may sometimes be frustrated with this process, but it's worth it, we promise. So with that, I want to turn to our discussion, and I'll hand it over to Tina to lead this part.
Yeah, so we're really looking forward to this section here. We would love to hear from you. Do you have any examples of success that you would be willing to share with us? You can chat those in the question box. The other thing is, if you actually have a question about how to effectively engage volunteers as ambassadors, we'd love to hear what challenges you're facing, and we can brainstorm together on how you might be able to address that. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Emily, who is managing our chat box, and she can let us know what questions have come in.
Great. We do have a few audience questions. Our first is, are you aware of any short training videos that could be shared with volunteers through email on how to make that ask?
So one thing that I will say, and this is not necessarily specific to making the ask, although our fundraising team may have a resource like that posted, but these webinars, we have several of them posted to the Campbell & Company webpage and on the communications team page in particular. And those are things that many of my clients have found very helpful, even if they just share specific snippets of that. So for example, I know our director, Andy Bromwell, has several that talk about just what is a case for support? Why is it important to have one? Those kind of the basics of what you need to know to serve as an ambassador. So those I know are very effective resources. Tina, are there any specific to making an ask that you could refer this listener to?
Yeah, I actually don't know of any, but you know what? I would like our firm to develop one. I think it's a great idea. We could actually do that. So we will commit to doing it. Might take a little time, but we will definitely get something out there. And I think, like, from what I'm hearing from the question is, it's not really like helping the actual fundraising staff or executive director make the ask themselves, but it is a special video that could be shared with your volunteers to help get them comfortable. And maybe we could think about doing something like that specifically for volunteers. And of course, one of the key things is we won't make it too long because we know that it'll be hard for them. And we'd have to think about how to make it generally applicable regardless of what kind of organization you are. If your volunteers are local or national, international, we want to try to make it useful for all those different kinds of different types of situations. So we'll have to think about that a little bit. But thank you very much for that question.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what is the best way to empower and embed confidence amongst volunteers so they can adapt and feel autonomous without needing to seek approval and next steps?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that one of the key things that is important to remember with volunteers when you're working with them is to remind them to continually give you updates on their work and what they learn from those conversations. Because in essence, what we need them to do is, submit some sort of contact report so that the information they gather in their conversations isn't completely lost. It'll help for future discussions. But then, if they have a general outline of what we're trying to get to and where we're trying to go, I think what you're checking in on is whether or not they need to be checking back with you on every single little step. I mean, I actually would encourage them to check back with you because it always helps to debrief and discuss it. But if you feel like that maybe they can take the next step also on their own, then maybe you could let them go ahead and do that. But I might encourage you to stay in very close contact with them because you might together determine that the best next step is something different than what that person originally thought, and maybe there's something they don't know about that's going on in the organization. Or let's say it's a prospect who might be in another country, like in another city, but they might not have known that your executive director was actually about to go there in 2 weeks, and so they could maybe set up a meeting. So for reasons like that, just to have full context, I think it is good to have good check-ins, but if you are able to provide your volunteer with a full outline of what a typical donor journey looks like, then they have some sense of what can they manage to continue to progress on their own versus checking in with you every step of the way.
Right.
Christina,
right.
you have something to add.
Yeah. So I think there's sort of two pieces to this question. So the first relates to the process of outreach, which I think Tina's response speaks to very well. And I think that connects also to the earlier point that we talked about under strategy number 1 of being very clear about how you are there to support them. So some of my clients have put together a kind of process guide or overview so that volunteers understand where it is that they plug in and what it is that they need to report back, and trying the best to sort of distill that and make that very simple for volunteers so that they understand what the process is. But the other part of this question, I think, relates to ownership of the case. And this is something that I do see volunteers struggle around and feel a little bit fearful of. If they think that the case for support is a script that they need to memorize, that can be quite intimidating. If they're afraid to say the wrong thing or put it the wrong way, that's something that can really hold volunteers back when we want them to go out and be really confident with serving as ambassadors. So one exercise that I've done with volunteers that I find tremendously helpful is to start by, as I say, kind of getting off the page. Pose a general question to your volunteers about their passion, dedication for the organization. Allow them to talk personally and extemporaneously about why they care. And then what I do is I connect it then back to the formal quote unquote case for support. So usually what volunteers have then is a kind of aha moment where they understand, oh, the things that I love about this organization are all the things that we're asking folks to support. And so being able to see the connection between their personal passion and the quote unquote official case for support is very, very important. The other thing that I find very helpful is to, in these practice sessions where we're asking folks to role play, practice your elevator pitch, whatever the case may be very specific that we're not asking them to approach the case as a script. We're asking them to approach the case as a springboard for conversation. So, don't feel like you need to memorize the whole thing. Think about what are the 3 key points. And one of those key points really should be, what is it that drives you to care so much about the organization? So really empowering them to think about what their personal connection is and to share that personal connection can help to create confidence and comfort on that front.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I have 2 success stories that I'd like to share. First is from Stephanie, who said, We've asked our board/advisory team which skills from coaching to helping buy a car they'd be willing to apply towards the local leaders that we are training and providing resources for. And then our next success story is, I find involving leadership, chair, et cetera, in designing and delivering training and orientation is very effective. Great. Thank you for submitting those stories. Our next question is, how can you regain the power dynamic when you have a board who is telling you, the staff, what to do?
That's a meaty one.
So this is a tough one, but one of the things that I think is important, let's say you have a group of volunteers that doesn't really understand the role, the powerful role they can play in helping with fundraising. They're not used to doing it. They really weren't actually recruited with the understanding that that was going to be a way in which you expected them to help. I think what's important in a case like that is to try to figure out if you have any champions on your board that are currently there that understand maybe from previous experience they have on other boards, or maybe they just really care so much they want to help in any way they can, including with fundraising, and to see if you can find those few people, have conversations with them, and strategize, how can we turn this around and get the board to be more engaged in this way, and then to have the board member be the one to speak at board meetings to try to bring his or her fellow board members on board. So to not have you be the one to always be sending that message, but to have one of the peers. I would say another effective way, but maybe, another alternate could be to have an outside person come in and say something like deliver this message, and that could be from a consultant. One of the issues is if the board knows that the staff member invited the consultant, they might be skeptical or not really receptive to the messages. So if there's also, in that case, if the board can say, we really need to do this, or a board member says, let's bring in an outside voice to tell us, what we can do to improve our situation here. That also can be effective. I also find with boards, because they are community members, they actually are super competitive with other boards that they hear about and other boards for similar organizations to the organizations that they're serving with. So it can sometimes help to gather some amount of benchmarking information as well. You could say, well, if we look at, let's say you're an independent school. We look at the local independent schools and look, their boards are giving X percent of the annual fund, or their board members had 100% giving in the last campaign, or something like that. Whatever your situation is, think about what statistics would be most meaningful and motivating if they heard that the school down the street or the other organization across town was succeeding in ways that they feel well, we could do that too, and we should. This is an embarrassment, kind of in a sense shaming them, but benchmarking information can be very helpful because it's neutral, right? It's just sharing data with them, so that can work too. But I'd love to hear what Christina has to say as well.
Yeah. So first of all, this is it's a challenging dynamic, but it's also challenging to answer because there are so many different reasons why that dynamic could be happening. In any case, I thoroughly agree with Tina's point about bringing in an external voice or external information where possible. Something that I say to my clients a lot is it's hard to be a prophet in your own land, and that's really true for just about every organization that I've worked with, certainly, and it's something that's tremendously valuable about whatever that external voice is, whether it's a consultant or not. I'll also say, though, that sometimes this dynamic happens in organizations that are a little bit younger, and by younger I don't mean the age of the participants, but the age of the organization, and they may have a board that is less mature and more comfortable functioning as a working board, a hands-on type of board, and that's where you kind of get into these power struggle sometimes as an organization is trying to grow and mature. So one of the things that I think can be really helpful is to, work with board members for something like a strategic planning process or drafting new or revised board expectations around their roles so that everyone has a shared understanding about kind of who does what, why. And that I think can be helpful. One thing that I would encourage you to remember, and I think this is true just generally of this topic, and that is that, your volunteers from your board down to, someone working on the program, they're involved because they care. So sometimes dynamics can get complicated, can get difficult, but ultimately I do think that it's important to remember that all of us come to this with really good motivations and wanting to move missions forward. So sometimes starting from that point of view can help us again to be kind of patient as we're looking to find effective ways to engage our volunteers.
Great, thank you so much for that. I don't think we have time for any more questions, but I would like to share 2 more success stories. The first one being from Michelle. I work with large groups of volunteers, 50 plus, ages 12 and up. Over the last 2 events, I've developed cards for the FAQs and roles for their job duties at the event. This has helped the volunteers feeling more prepared and has also saved me a ton of time after the team huddle. And then our next story is from Patricia. I am the Director of Leadership of Annual Giving at Santa Clara University. We created a volunteer group called the 1851 League the year we were founded. We asked them to be a part of the group because they are philanthropic and social leaders in our community, and that holds true now more than ever. So we decided during this time to send them a weekly email that highlights the key points that our university has been sharing during this time, in the hopes that if anyone asks them what SCU is doing, they will be our ambassadors, as well as fun items such as easy recipes, color pages, TED Talks, or podcasts by our alumni.
Wow, I really love those. Those are excellent. Yeah, to go back to that first one, this idea of a pocket card, kind of like a little cheat sheet that they can have on hand, ready to go, quick reminder before they see someone. That is great. And that group that, being able to arm them with information, it just sounds, and timely information, going a little extra, taking that extra step to do that sounds wonderful. Yeah, really appreciate you all sharing those. Thank you. Keep up the good work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, if we didn't answer your question, we'll follow up with you after the webinar to make sure we can, help as much as possible. And we'd just like to thank you for joining us today. And within 24 hours, you'll be receiving a follow-up email from GoToWebinar with a link to the recording, slides, and all of the resources mentioned in today's presentation. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to email our presenters with any questions you have. And with that, we'd like to thank you and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.